Welcome to Ancient Wisdom for Modern Work. In the hustle of profit, product, and productivity, it's easy to neglect the how, our ethics, our conduct, and our internal state of being. But what if the secret to sustainable success wasn't found in the latest management trend, but in wisdom that's existed for thousands of years? The host of this podcast, Kimberly Kayler, is here to explore the ancient concepts of Yamas and Niyamas as a powerful framework for modern leadership. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to Ancient Wisdom for Modern Work, a podcast designed to help you apply proven lessons from the yogi masters of yesteryear to the work we do today. I'm your host and guide, Kimberly Kayler, and it's my great pleasure to share my insight on how to meld mindfulness into our work world, however you define work, as a teacher, a corporate executive, or community volunteer. Even though I am typically your host, we're actually going to flip the script today. And my dear friend, fellow yogi master, as well as business pro, Melissa Rabska, is going to ask me questions about my book, which is going to be published on June 16th. So, Melissa, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Yes, absolutely. Excited to get into this.
So, Melissa, I'll let you take it away.
All right, beautiful. I'm glad to be here to ask you all the tough questions or not so tough questions. And to kick us off, I want to talk a little bit starting with ahimsa, which is the first yama, and often is translated as nonviolence. Although that often conjures for people relation to the Judeo-Christian Ten Commandments and do not kill, if you look at this yama closely, you'll learn it's not just what you do to others, but also the harm that you can do to yourself. In the book, you talk about how one of the ways this shows up in the work that we do is assuming we know what's best for others. Can you explain this a little bit more?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is a great way to kick off our conversation. So, in the book, I actually start with a yoga example. I share, and this is something I share in teacher training quite a bit, is something early in my yoga teaching career in which I was moving through the room as a yoga teacher and came upon a student that to me looked like she was slightly uncomfortable in a common pose for yoga called child's pose. And that is a forward facing pose. You're down on your knees, your hips are kind of back towards your heels, and you're spread out with your belly coming towards your thighs. And with her permission, I gave her a little bit of an adjustment. I moved her hips around and then I asked her, I said, gee, do you feel better in this? And she looked at me and she said, I didn't feel bad before. And so that was actually a little flustering for me, especially as a new teacher, because I had just come out of this training. We're helping people get into a pose, and I assumed I knew what was best for her and her body. Now, I did all the right things. I asked permission before I touched her and talked that through with her. But it really created an impression on me of just the importance of not assuming we know how somebody feels in a pose or what they're looking for. Well, how does this apply to our work world? A lot of overlays. We tend to create decisions based on habits, especially with regard to someone's preference for things. One of the examples I do share in the book is just an example of a management decision in terms of moving somebody into a new leadership role. And these managers are having a discussion and they say, oh, gee, Mark's not going to be interested in that. You know, he's passed down these opportunities in the past because he said he didn't want to travel and he had young kids and quickly move on, you know, only to come find out if you would actually have a discussion with Mark, you would find out that his children are older and he's ready and the time is right and he wants to actually start to spread his wings a little bit. So it's really key for us to moving back into ahimsa in the business world to make sure we don't make assumptions, we don't make decisions for other people. We give them an opportunity to actually share where they are.
That's a beautiful way to explain that yama. I know that was personally one of my favorite examples from the book that really hit hard for me. And then thinking about and moving into satya, our second yama, or truthfulness. Once again, this yama goes beyond how we should be truthful to others, but also how we should be truthful to ourselves. One of the key ways that you explore this theme is related to feedback, which is always such a challenging issue. Can you share some examples of this?
Sure, definitely. So feedback is something that we're not typically good about giving, or even receiving in corporate America, in today's day and age. You very well may have some sort of review process where you work, but typically reviews happen once or maybe twice a year if you're fortunate enough for that to happen. And they recount things that maybe you did wrong as well as things you did right. But we miss the opportunity if we're not providing regular feedback to really help that person grow. Having difficult conversations is one of the reasons that people don't give feedback very often, is because it requires you to very quickly after something happens provide feedback, give some input in terms of how something could be better. And by not providing that feedback, we actually rob people the opportunity to grow, to showcase, to learn, especially when we're just in some sort of a cycle of just reviews. Reviews also tend to be not very reflective. We tend to just kind of catalog the things that somebody screwed up maybe over the year, or they didn't do as well as we'd wanted to, or disappointments, and we forget all the wins along the way. So this Yama actually gives us a chance to really explore the importance of feedback and also invite us to get good at having those tough conversations, which is something that is a theme throughout the entire book.
And related to that, just a little bit of a follow-up. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between being truthful and being nice?
Definitely. So this Yama actually asks us to really sit with and explore what it is like to be truthful, not only with yourself, but with others. But then also, what kind of disservice are we doing, or how much harm are we causing by sharing the truth? And many of us were raised with maybe your mom or dad or your grandparents saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, which there's a lot of truth to that. That is wise wisdom. But are we holding something back that could help a person grow, especially in a corporate setting? Obviously, there's nicer ways to do things, and that's where, again, the art of having feedback. This also goes to being truthful with ourselves. Are we actually clearly understanding where we are, what we view on something? And I'm actually listening to a book right now that even goes beyond being nice, but being kind. And I don't know, maybe there's a part two of my book at some point, but especially, in the Midwest, we're known for our passive aggressive being nice. And how can we go beyond that to actually truly being kind too? So a lot to explore there, but I think it's a really fun topic and something that's really beneficial.
Great, thank you for that. I feel like especially in the Midwest, it's such a great distinction to have your listeners key in on for sure. And then thinking and moving ahead to the third yama, asteya, is this is typically described as non-stealing. And again, this goes beyond the Judeo-Christian concept of, not stealing from others, but really it also is related to not stealing time, opportunity, and the like. One of the key ways that this shows up in the business world is our multitasking, hurry up culture. Can you talk to us a little bit about this yama in that context?
Definitely. So we very much are a hurry up culture, a multitasking culture. A lot of times when I do workshops and tackle this one, there's actually an exercise I do where people can determine how good they are of a multitasker. And it's something that typically when people find, oh, wow, I'm really good at multitasking, and they celebrate it, I unfortunately tell them, hey, that's bad news, because you've trained your brain that you need to be constantly multitasking, and our brains actually aren't designed that way. So when we do multitask, we rob ourselves the opportunity to truly be connected to things. We rob ourselves the opportunity to connect with others. We all have those examples. You're in these meetings and people aren't really paying attention, or they're on their phone, or they're distracted. They don't have their cameras on. They're not engaging. So this Yama gives us an opportunity to really sit with that and figure out, how can you be more deliberate? How can you be more committed? How can you be more connected to the work that's in front of you? There's a statistic that shows that our brains are actually thinking about things other than the task we're doing about anywhere from like 40 to 60% of the time. So think about that. How can you, as you are a leader in a team, help make sure that your team members are actually engaged in the work they're doing, as well as engaged in the people that they're interacting with, their other team members, their clients, your customers, etc.
Wonderful. And then the next yama that we're going to be discussing is brahmacharya, which is, I don't know if I nailed it or not. Kimberly will let me know in a second, but it also means non-excess, which is a lot easier to say in my opinion. So this yama is often misconstrued as celibacy or abstinence, but a better interpretation of it is really sacredness in your own actions, living within your limits. How does this apply to us and the work that we do?
So Melissa, you did a great job. Brahmacharya, you knocked that out of the park. So great work on that. I think where I'd love to focus related to this yama is just the importance and again, that hurried culture that we're in, the excess that we have right now in terms of email and meetings. And I talk quite a bit about in the book about our culture in which many of us are just completely crippled with emails. And we're also overbooked with meetings too. And I lead everybody through a process that we've gone through with my own consulting firm to determine when do you really need to send an email? When do you need to actually have a meeting? And how can you be deliberate in all of those things? Just because we are so tired and so overburdened. This is something that became eye-opening to me when I was actually on vacation and I was waking up because of the time zone change. I was waking up to 300 emails each day. And I recognize like there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way. And exploring different organizations in terms of some of the lessons that they've learned. I have some friends who work for big corporations that have done a lot of great work with regards to this and that non-excess, simple things that you could implement right off the bat, such as making sure that all of your meetings and at 50 minutes after the hour, so people have a chance to look at emails before the next one. As simple as actually having time for a bio break or to get a glass of water is really, really key too. So those are some of the things that we can talk about with regard to non-excess.
And then rounding out our discussion about the yamas, I'm going to let Kimberly give us the Sanskrit vocabulary lesson for this yama. And we're going to talk a little bit about non-possessiveness. So within this chapter on this yama, you have a line at the start of it that says, what we possess possesses us. But you're not just talking about physical stuff in this section. It's also about saying no, which is very, very difficult for most individuals. Can you tell us more about that?
Definitely. So it's a parigraha is what we're talking about here. I think I'd love to start this discussion by talking a little bit about the importance of asking what you should stop doing. So too often when we are adding to our plate, when we're doing, strategic planning for our organization, as we're talking about the things that we're going to put into the budget for next year and our activities, we do a horrible job of actually asking the question of what should we stop doing. And a lot of activities, reports, tasks become somewhat sacred and protected because they made such good sense at one time that we fail to look at, do they still make sense? And we become guarded about it, and it becomes somebody's role and responsibility, and we don't want to hurt their feelings, so we don't ask the questions. But it's really key to make sure that we stop and ask, what should we stop doing? The other part about this whole baggage, what we possess possesses us, is really making sure that you develop a very fine-tuned skill of listening without predetermining. And we're all guilty of this in terms of going into a conversation and we're so prepared and pointed in terms of what's going to come out of our mouth. We may not truly be listening and engaging into that conversation too. So those are some of the key things that we talk about in the book that's really key here. Of course, email fits in here too, as with non-excess, like that's pulled into here. So a lot related to this yama that helps round out the yamas with regard to, how we just govern our own actions.
And then kind of following up on email, I know that you mentioned this with our previous Yama, and you mentioned a little bit now. Is there anything that you want to talk about in terms of how email fits into this concept of non-possessiveness, or yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think it's really key, again, setting aside whether it's an email, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a communication, of understanding what the point is of what you're doing. Um, you know, I've gotten into the habit recently of even declaring, like, this is the purpose of the meeting that we're having here. And even sharing that sometimes in an email as well is really, really key. Once again, looking back in terms of, and this isn't, new advice, but it's one that we tend to forget, especially when we're upset or we're backed into a corner. Can you sit on that response until the next day? Can you let things sit? That's a really hard one for me, or it was a hard one for me to learn because I'm known for being responsive. But I've learned sometimes if I sit back even for 12 hours, sometimes things will actually work themselves out on their own. So again, what we possess possesses us, and it goes beyond the clutter, the baggage, the stuff that we bring along with us. Another tip just related to email that is really, really key. And we've all experienced that all of a sudden three more people are copied into something. And especially when things get heated for some reason. And then all of a sudden you now have 12 people copied into something, all of them trying to decipher what's going on and reading to the bottom of the email chain. So how can you take a step back and really say, who needs to be a part of this? How can I summarize what's happening? How can we start fresh? So those are some of the things that we actually dive into a little bit more. And this applies whether you're in a corporate America setting, but think of your volunteer work. Think of the boards that you sit on for nonprofits. How can you make the most of everybody's time and also make sure that you really value what they bring to the table?
Very well put, especially from somebody that feels inundated by emails and all the things. So I think that is very well said, and I'm excited to try to implement some of that. I know in my world for sure. So switching gears, and we're going to turn now to the Niyamas. So while the Yamas govern how to behave in the world, the Niyamas provide guidance on how we move through the world. And with that, we're going to start with self-study, or satya, or purity. So with this concept, regarding to values and transparency, can you talk to us a little bit about how this may show up in regard to hiring practices?
Definitely. So we, as a society, have fallen into this trap in which we are hiring for a list of skills and a list of attributes. Um, and I think we're losing the magic of our hiring people, and whether or not they're a good cultural fit for things. And you've probably all experienced this, whether it's on a nonprofit, a board, if you're a teacher, if it's corporate America, how we plug people in because their resume looks good. So I talk in the book about the importance of making sure that somebody is very much a cultural fit for your organization. So how do you do that? That's pretty tough until somebody's part of it. Some key ways to do it, and this is a bit of a luxury. You can't always actually do this, but I tend to hire good people that I meet that, yes, they may have the skills, or I know that I can grow the skills, but I know that they're actually a really good fit for our organization. I have a silly rule that has always served me well, that I don't hire anybody unless I've actually had a chance to break bread with them and go to a meal with them at a restaurant. It's served me well because I can see how they interact with wait staff. Are they able to transition between discussion on their personal life and their business life? Are they able to hold a conversation? Now that those things are important to me in our consulting world, that people need to be able to interact at that level. That may not be something that you are looking for in your organization, but looking at that is really, really key to make sure that you are hiring for a culture fit for your organization.
So related to culture is a little bit that's been definitely coming up in the news for several years, ever since the pandemic, is burnout and how that can impact the people in your organization or even the organization itself. Can you talk a little bit more about it within the context of Yamas and Niyamas?
Definitely. So I think the key here is making sure that you as a leader are actually modeling that work-life balance and whatever that may mean. And that's really, really key because we all know and maybe have even worked for leaders that stress the and say the words about work-life balance and family is important and all these things, but they don't model it in any way. So modeling it is really, really key so that your team feels supported and able to follow suit. With regard to burnout, too, I'm a big believer in having individual development plans for our team members. And that's really key, whether you're on a board or whether you're in a corporate setting. We do know now that with 5 generations in the workforce, the youngest 2 generations actually not only crave, in many cases, like almost demand to have that work plan. They want to know what their career path is. So helping them see what that looks like and not just putting them on a hamster wheel where they feel like they have to work 60 hours a week and that burnout, help them understand what the expectations are to move to through their career path.
I love that so much. So moving away though from burnout to our next niyama, which is also a good tie, is Santosa or contentment. You talk a lot about the science of the brain and the role it plays in our interactions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Definitely. So I'm a little bit of a brain geek, and I had the chance in the book to just start to talk about it a little bit. So contentment is really, really key, and it plays to some of the earlier yamas as well with regards to not predetermining conversations, reactions, truly listening. So our brain actually is pretty darn smart, and it quickly goes to the thoughts that we access the most. And the thoughts that we don't access actually are cleaned each night. There's a protein called a C1q protein that was discovered by neuroscientists, people a lot smarter than me, about 10, 15 years ago. And they were able to, they meaning these scientists, were able to recognize that what our brain doesn't access at night, we don't have those neural pathways, which we hear about, the brain actually has a way of cleaning that and getting rid of it. So what happens the next morning is those good happy thoughts, if we don't access them very often, our brain has this like super highway fast, pathway to go straight to those negative thoughts. So how does this all relate to contentment and santosha? Well, it's really key that we are able to have some sort of mindfulness exercises, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute as well, but to really know how to stop the negative talk to ourselves, to others, to really take care of our brain. The great thing about our brain is that we can rewire it too. So, if we're able to have the positive thoughts, the positive interactions, we can create, even a better superhighway.
Wonderful. So moving to tapas or self-discipline. In this section, you highlight the role of leadership, vision, and then strategy. Can you talk to us more about viewpoints on being strategic versus habitual?
Definitely. So this is something that I actually codified, as you will, because I lived it during the pandemic. So many of the organizations that we helped, as I do a lot of crisis communications, were acting out of habit, and they were mistaken thinking it was actually strategy. And we see this quite a bit, things that you'd always do but have no strategic thought to them. That's a habit. That's not a strategy. So, thinking through just contextually how this played out during the pandemic with organizations is they would have to gather to make decisions with regards to whether they close the office, based on the latest ruling that came out in your community or your state, et cetera. And they would gather in, albeit maybe gathering virtually, gather leadership to make decisions in terms of the next step. only to then a couple days later, when new information would come out, they'd have to gather again and again and again. And what we ended up with was decision fatigue. People were frankly tired of making decisions. And that's moved forward out of the pandemic with organizations. Organizations at that time, in many cases, it was the first time they really had to address their people. And I don't mean that to sound as harsh as I stated it, but of course they had HR, they had employee benefits, they cared about their people before, but they had to really look at their employees on a human level, or their constituents, or the members of their organizations. So how do we deal with this? I talk in the book quite a bit about the key components of actually developing strategy, what that looks like, the questions to ask yourself if, are you operating out of habit, or do you truly have a strategy for how you're going to navigate and how you're going to take care of your teams?
And related to that is the next niyama or self-study. And again, Kimberly will assist with the Sanskrit that I'm a little rusty on. And I love how within this section that you highlight the Rotary's four-way test in here. Can you tell us how this relates to the work that we do?
Definitely. So self-study, or svadhyaya, I really struggled with how to address this in the book when I came to this chapter and I was writing it. And as a longtime Rotarian, one day it just occurred to me that the four principles that Rotarians ask themselves actually applied really, really well here. And Rotary is a business organization founded in 1905. The idea is to bring business leaders together to serve their community. So I really like the interplay between business and community that come here. So Rotary's four-way test is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? So there's a lot of lessons there, maybe developing your own four-way test within your own organization of truly looking at the things that we're doing. I talk in the book also just about the pursuit of profit and our society's interest now in organizations going beyond profit. I mean, of course, shareholders, if are interested in that, but being mission driven and not profit being the only way that you measure success. So that plays out in this chapter.
Beautiful. Thank you for expanding on that. And then our final niyama is surrender, which Kimberly will round this out with our final Sanskrit lesson today, if I can say that 10 times fast. And one of the key elements that I enjoyed in this chapter is the commentary on passing the torch. Can you elaborate more about what you mean by that?
Sure. So we're talking about Ishvara Pranihana, or that surrender element. And this chapter can go in many different ways, but I felt that how I wanted to end it, based on my experience, both as a community volunteer as well as in a corporate setting, is to really talk about succession planning and the importance of that. If I summarize this chapter, it'd be get out of the way. And I'm actually, with my own company right now, really trying to build pathways for those that are coming into the organization for me to set them up for success. And then I need to get out of the way. I've seen so many examples in my 30-year career of leaders that stayed on too long. It was not only harmful to their organization and those that were coming up. In many cases, you would lose those heir apparents or others in the organization, but it was also harmful to themselves. So many of us, if somebody would just have left a couple years earlier, they waited too long to leave. And at some point, it's really, really key that we make room for the next generations. That's the greatest compliment you can have as a leader, is for you to be able to move along and your team be able to step in and keep moving things. So we are all replaceable. We don't like to think of ourselves as that, but we are. And a good leader is replaceable by putting those things into place. So those are some of the key things that I talk about. Other elements of surrender is really just trying to find some balance and some peace. Talk a little bit about mindfulness in the book as well, as to what that may look like in your setting.
Well, thank you, Kimberly, so much for having me on to talk a little bit more about your book coming up. Is there anything else that you would like to chat about today before I turn it back over to you?
I think that the only thing one of the common questions I get is just what's the best way to use this book. So each chapter is designed to be standalone, or you can read it from beginning to end. So, as you browse through it, if there's a chapter that maybe is speaking to you, great, you can settle in with that. At the end of each chapter, I have questions that you can review as a leader with yourself, and then as well as with your team, as well as some highlights. So hopefully it's something that you can pull out, look at, depending on where you are in the continuum of reading the book. I also included a case study at the end to try and bring all of these concepts to life in a realistic way. So welcome to hear how others enjoy it, as well as feedback and questions that they may have. So be sure to visit wisdomfortheworkwedo.com, as well as subscribe to this podcast, as we've got a lot of other topics, including a breakdown of every single chapter in the podcast.
Great. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for sitting down with me, Melissa.
Thank you so much for listening to Ancient Wisdom for Modern Work, a podcast designed to meld mindfulness into the work we do. We invite you to subscribe, as well as visit wisdomfortheworkwedo.com for additional resources. Until next time, we invite you to consider how you can apply the wisdom yogi masters of yesteryear to the work we do today, with integrity, clarity, and compassion.